Yeah.
So it'll be
And in Alabama, when we were golfing,
on campus.
I had a chance to finally get my first like birdie.
Mhm.
It was a little bit, so it was like doable.
Thank you.
But it was like perfect. But it stopped like less than a foot from the cup, so I just easy tap in the corner.
It's so frustrating.
All right, so last time we talked about the meaning and value of work, because one of the things that we focus on in marketing is this idea of not just marketing to external customers. Marketing is the only fully integrated function of the firm, in that marketing seeks to add value across all aspects of the firm. And if you come away with nothing else from one of my classes, it should come rolling off your tongue. I had a kid several years ago who was retaking my class because he hadn't done so well the first time around. And I started with, what is it that you should know about marketing in a class? And he's like, marketing is the only fully integrated function of the firm. It came rolling off of his tongue. And so we not only market to external constituents, but we also seek to add value. And one of the things that we have discussed in marketing literature is this idea of living the brand. And so we talked about the meaning and value of work last time, the fact that work is one of these things that we all have to do. Most of us are not born independently wealthy. And even if we are sort of independently wealthy, lots of people choose to work, even if they are independently wealthy. My brother he's retired now. We started a law firm because he's gotten bored. He retired from Goldman Sachs and he got bored, and we've started a law firm because he needs to find meaning and value in his life. And work is the way that we oftentimes do that. It's the way we oftentimes define who we are. And so it's important. Part of the ways that we define meaning and value is through a discussion of rights and responsibilities in the workplace. We did not talk about rights and responsibilities last time, as I recall. Is that correct? Okay, so we're going to try and get through both rights and responsibilities. We're supposed to do rights today and responsibilities on Thursday. We have a sales competition that I will have to be at on Thursday. So I know you're going to be sad, you're going to be crying, but I will not be here on Thursday. So I'm going to try and get through both rights and responsibilities today. If we don't get through it all today, we will get through it on next Tuesday. You have an opportunity this Thursday if you want. I will send out an email that tells you if you want bonus points, you can show up in addition to the ducks. You can get bonus points through ducks, right? Because you can get more ducks than you need, and that'll count as bonus points. That's an opportunity to get bonus points. The other way is you can attend the Challenger Sales Institute's career fair. You have to come dressed in business casual, which means slacks and a polo, and you can go to the career fair, and I'll give you 5 points for every one of the career fair participants that you talk to. There are a number of companies there that are hiring for sales jobs, so you're welcome to do that. It will be at the Love's corporate headquarters on Thursday, maybe Wednesday as well. I'll send you an email on D2L that details this, and I'll give you 5 bonus points for every company that you talk to. You just have to take a selfie with yourself and the company. If you're really smart, what you would do is you put together your resume. How many of you have a resume? Everybody has, and bring copies of your resume so you can talk to companies and give them your resume. It is a sales competition and a sales career fair. However, they will have people there that will probably have, they're recruiters. They're not salespeople. They're recruiters, and they'll probably be recruiting for other positions as well besides sales. So take your resume, dress well, take a selfie, and for everyone that you take, it'll be at the Love's campus. I'll give you the details, and you can get bonus points for that on Thursday if you want. All right. There's also, I think, an opportunity on Wednesday as well. So there's 2 days that you could go. Okay. I'll double check and make sure on that. So we're going to talk about moral rights in the workplace and then responsibilities as well in the workplace. So let's discuss some cases, actual cases. A salesman is fired after he gets a fairly large sale and the commission is paid to his boss who fired him. Ethical or unethical? Just based on that set of facts, what would you say? You say it's unethical. Why?
Because he still made the sale. So
He still made the sale.
He should still get paid for it.
Okay. So maybe you should still fire him,
Yes.
but he should get the commission for that
Yes.
sale. That would be ethical. I think that's what most people say. It is a little more nuanced, the actual cases. He did make a big sale, but there were irregularities. The boss helped in closing the sale, and they ultimately decided to terminate the relationship. But it should be at least in proportion, right? It shouldn't be an all or nothing deal to the amount of effort that he put in. Now, that becomes really hard to determine. How much of it is, for example, in a lot of our sales jobs, with some companies, you are given a book of business when you start. So for example, with Gartner, when you start, they, in order to help you, they give you a book of business that you are then to further develop. So what percentage, that's really sticky in determining that kind of thing, isn't it?
I guess, depends. I mean, I know in real estate, when you do leads or if a brokerage gives you leads, they get a percentage of that lead on top of whatever your traditional
Commission
commission
is, right? So sorry. I swallowed wrong. I apologize. That's embarrassing. Learn not to breathe in while you drink. I normally drink stuff in class because I take a medication that dries me out for allergies. And so I apologize for that. But if I don't, I start to squeak. That's why I always have like coffee or something, because I start to sound like really parched and like Donald Duck after a while. Wow, sorry about that. Yeah, so historically, what you had was the commission on real estate is 6%. 3% goes to the listing agent and 3% goes to the selling agent. And then you pay a percentage of that to your broker, right? It's usually 50% goes to the broker. Now, other real estate firms have come up with different models. So for example, some of the real estate firms that I know of came up with a model where you didn't pay any of your commission, but they charged you for everything. They charged you for office space, for, percentages of the internet, for advertising, for MLS listings, for, your desk, your phone, things like that. So that is one way. So yeah, it's a percentage, so you can negotiate that if it's more your broker that helped you versus you. Sorry. Mandatory urine analysis for nicotine. This one became very controversial at the time. This was in the, I believe, early 2000s. This company started doing pee tests for nicotine usage. Should you be able to do that?
No, I don't think, it's technically not illegal, right?
It's not illegal. Again, one of the things that we think about in this class is there's, right, the law, right? And there's ethics, and they may overlap, but they're not necessarily mutually inclusive. Right? They're not necessarily exclusive. They're definitely not. There is an overlap there, but should you test for something that is legal? I'm gonna give you one. I'm gonna let you pick one from the basket, so it's not the one that I spit up all over. There's a difference between legal and ethical. So yeah, you can do it. You absolutely, although they challenge it, these employees actually challenge it, said that's a legal activity. I should be able to do what I want. What about drug testing? Should you be able to drug test?
I think there's a difference between something that like alters your perspective kind of, and nicotine, I mean, it's bad for you, but it doesn't, I mean, you're not getting high off nicotine, so I don't know.
Well, initially, that's why people start. I will tell you as a former smoker, that's like, when you the first few cigarettes you have, you do get a little buzz off of it.
That's like, why don't we drink like alcohol?
And it does, what about that? Should we test for alcohol? The reason the company decided to do this was they were a healthcare insurance company, and they said that obviously one of the biggest impacts and biggest costs for insurance companies is poor health, right? And so if you're smoking, that leads to all kinds of bad results, and it increases the amount of premiums that you're actually going to have to pay in covering employees if you have a sick workforce. So one of the things that's happened, for example, at UCO is we have a very, in many respects, older workforce because historically speaking, the professorate is old. I was unusual. I started teaching here when I was 22 years old. That's unusual. Most professors now look more like me than they did like you. When I first started teaching, I looked more like you than you. I was younger than most of you in here. How many of you are over 22? A few of you. All right. I mean, I looked like a baby, and I had problems as a result of that because I had the average age of our freshmen at the time was 29, which meant that all of my students were older than I was, and they would say things like, "That's a nice theory, but that's not the way it works." And I'd have to deal with that. How do you deal with that? What do you know about the real world? I was teaching political science. Is political science the real world anyway? Is that reality anyway? I don't know. But so because we have all of these, it takes a long time to become a college professor generally. You have to go and get an advanced degree. And anymore, that means you have to have the terminal degree, which is the PhD, or some form of doctoral degree. I have 2 of them. That means that you're generally not young. And then you stay a long time because this is one of the few jobs where you have a lot of security. Once you get tenure, you have a lot of protection. I used to do all of the training for hiring of tenured faculty members in these committees, and I would go in and I would talk to the committees about things that you couldn't ask of people in job interviews. And it's amazing how many smart people don't realize that you shouldn't ask things like, are you married? Do you have kids? Is your husband moving with you? Things that are like not relevant to the position, and you shouldn't ask those kinds of questions. But when I would do this training, I would follow a dean, and she would tell people, remember, you can divorce a spouse, but once you give somebody tenure, that's it. You're stuck with this person for life. Not exactly, but it was good advice. So we have a lot of people here that are older, and they have more health costs. And as a result, our insurance is more expensive than it is for a younger company. When my wife went to work for Chesapeake, when Chesapeake was going great guns here, it was a young company. And they did things to encourage people to keep healthcare costs down. Like, one of the things that the culture of the company was that if you were in a building and you were on the 2nd or 3rd or 4th floor, you took the stairs, you didn't take the elevator. That was they encouraged that. They had a gym on campus and encouraged people to go work out at lunch or on their breaks. Why? Keep healthcare costs down, keep insurance costs down. So if you're using nicotine, you may be increasing, but where does that end? We now know that alcohol, almost no amount of alcohol is safe. It's almost as bad as smoking. A sedentary lifestyle is now as bad as they're saying is as bad as smoking. Most of us have desk jobs where we sit down. The firing of an employee who was considering having an abortion. Now, they didn't fire her because they were objecting. They said that they fired her because she created a hostile work environment by talking about it. She created a work environment in which people were objecting to her choice. And they were harassing her at work. This one used to be a big one. Denying, oh, we're going through, why did it do this? Denying health and benefits to HIV positive employees. You can't do that anymore, but at one point in time, this was a big deal. You all have never lived in a world, I remember a world before HIV. In fact, the second person to die of HIV in Santa Fe, New Mexico was a tenant of my mother. My mother was a general contractor and she owned all of these rental homes and apartments as well, and an art gallery. And the second person in New Mexico to die of what we now know as HIV was one of her tenants. At the time, they didn't call it HIV. They called it GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, because it appeared that only homosexuals were the ones that were getting it. It was enormously, if you got diagnosed in the past with HIV, A, it was a death sentence, and B, it was going to be expensive because the drugs to treat it and keep you alive, even, 6 months to a year, were enormously expensive. And even if you didn't have drugs to treat it and keep you alive, just, the medical costs of having somebody basically put into assisted living, which is what it amounted to at the time, were enormously expensive. Is that ethical? Where would we end it? We now have the ability, I don't know how many of you have done this, I absolutely refuse to do it. My brother did it, and I couldn't believe as an attorney he did this. He bought these kits for everyone in my family the year that they came out, called 23andMe, and I refused to do it. And of course he did it. And I was like, I think we want to think about this before we start giving our genetic information to somebody else, to some third party. I think you might want to think about this. We could, in theory, before the Affordable Care Act, pre-existing conditions could be excluded from insurance coverage. What does that mean? Well, if you had a genetic marker that said you're likely, that could be considered a pre-existing condition. And we could exclude it, or they could have been excluded. This one has become less controversial. When I first started teaching this class, reading employees' emails, I don't think anybody thinks anything about this anymore. You understand that your emails, particularly if they're employer granted email, are not private, right? They're gonna read your emails. And probably one of the things that has happened as an attorney that I tell people all the time is stop using emails, and in this day and age, texting like it's the water cooler. People text everything. Laugh out loud. My boss says you fill in the blank. And you think that it doesn't go away, right? Somebody screen captures that. Talking on social media. Pre-employment psychological testing. This one involved questions that were off of a well-known test that said things like, I believe there's only one true religion. I believe there's only one God. I wish I did not have so many thoughts about sex during the day. And I really love this one. I have had no difficulty starting, stopping, or controlling my urine flow. Is that ethical? It's off of a test called the MMPI, Minnesota Multi-Phase Personality Inventory. You might have taken something similar. It's not a scientific test. I absolutely hate it. Not the MMPI is scientific. There's one that's more widely used by businesses and they love it and they do it all the time. And you probably have taken it and they talk about it. And I know in the management courses here, they give it to you. And I absolutely hate the fact that they give you this test. It's called Myers-Briggs. How many of you have taken the Myers-Briggs test? A few of you. Yeah, I hate that test. It's not scientific. It's completely it's pseudoscience. But people like it. Should we use testing like that to determine whether or not you're a good fit for a company?
It's on the job.
Okay, what kind of job would you say it's okay to do that? I will give you one of these ducks
I was in the
instead.
military, so I had to do psychological testing for certain jobs, so I think it was just depending on some of the jobs, and some of the employment testing isn't necessarily, or in that case in the military, wasn't a factor to say you were or weren't gonna get the job, but it was also for baseline testing because they utilized that testing down the line just to see where you were in your scale, depending on what the job was, cause
Okay.
what I was
Like
doing.
military police, maybe if you're gonna give somebody a gun and let them shoot people.
Yeah.
They should be well balanced. Think that's reasonable,
Yes.
but, you know, I don't know, in the military, they have all kinds of jobs. The person who's, you know, the base commander's secretary, is it real important for
No.
her?
No.
Maybe, I don't know, she's got lots of sensitive information,
Yeah.
or he
Yes, but
has
no.
lots of sensitive information. No?
No.
What about the base commander? They're responsible for thousands of people's lives. What about denying positions to females that may be detrimental to their pregnancy? This one actually has some Oklahoma ties. There's a very famous case called the Silkwood case that happened here in Oklahoma, right up the road. So if you go out to Portland Avenue and you take a right and you head straight up Portland, that becomes a state highway. I think it's 74. There was a plant that was owned by the Kerr-McGee Company on the Cimarron River. It was called the Cimarron Facility, right outside of Crescent, America. Any of you been to Crescent? My niece used to be on the city council in Crescent. Crescent's an interesting community. But there was this plant that was owned by Kerr-McGee. They manufactured nuclear fission materials at that plant. And one of the employees was named Karen Silkwood. They made a movie about this. You can rent it. It's kind of hard to find. I think I found it on YouTube. It's hard. I couldn't even find it on Amazon Prime. It stars Meryl Streep as Karen Silkwood and Cher as her best friend, who they call in the movie Dolly. That was not her real name. Her real name was Sherry Ellis, and she was actually a client of my law partner, my late law partner. She became basically irradiated at that plant, and she was sneaking fissionable material out so that she could prove that there were problems in the plant. But as a result of the fact that they had determined that there could be harm to female workers if they were pregnant, they were beginning to not allow them to have those kinds of jobs. And they had a way of testing, and now they put a badge on you in these facilities, and when the badge gets to a certain point, you can't work in certain parts of the plants anymore because you've reached the maximum amount of radiation. Should you deny positions to females that could become pregnant? Or not? Is that a BFOQ? I don't know. Bonafide occupational qualification. When we talk about bonafide occupational qualifications, there are a couple of ways that we can view this. There are BFOQs that have what we call disparate impact on people that appear outwardly objective, but limit the amount of applicants of certain categories in their ability to compete that job. So I'll give you an example of one that's a legitimate, but has a what we call a disparate impact on female applicants. If you want to be, as I understand it, a prison guard in a male prison facility in many states, and I believe including Oklahoma, there are certain physical fitness requirements that you have to meet. One of those physical fitness tests that they have you do in many states, and I believe that they still do this in Oklahoma, although I haven't checked in the last 5 years or so to see if they're still doing this, is you have to be able to drag something like a 275-pound dummy across a gym floor. This has a disparate impact on who? Huh?
Women.
Women. Yes, it has a disparate impact on women. Why? Because there are far fewer women that can drag a 275-pound dummy. Now, is that a legitimate BFOQ, bona fide occupational qualification? Generally speaking, the courts have said yes, because it is closely related to the skill set that is necessary to perform the essential functions of the job. That makes sense? Like, if you are a prison guard in a male facility, I think they figured out that the average person in these facilities weighs 275 pounds. And so, is that a legitimate? Yeah. Generally speaking, the courts have said yes. But are women capable of producing nuclear fissionable materials just the same as men? Yeah. So work is controlled by others. And when we talk about rights, we can talk about legal rights, which also have moral implications. Legal rights like the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which also leads to the acronym which we call OSHA for the administrative agency that oversees it. So it's the Occupational Safety and Health Act, and it's overseen by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the Family Medical Leave Act, ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, and things like that. Those are important. And these largely are rules that we have developed as a result of moral failures in the workplace. The Fair Labor Standards Act is a result of the fact that employees in the past, in the Industrial Revolution at the beginning of the 20th century, were oftentimes taken advantage of and exploited. And we use child labor in some of these instances. And so we said, like, there's a minimum wage that you have to use, right? We can also talk about contractual rights, and contractual rights are ones that also may or may not have moral import. And then, of course, there are purely moral rights. What are the moral rights that we can expect in the workplace? One of the things that we can talk about in terms of both contractual rights and legal rights and a moral implication is something called the right to work. Now, these have become popular all throughout the United States. Right to work sounds good, and lots of states passed laws that apply to right to work. And what it basically says is these laws are ones that say you don't have to be forced to join a union in order to get a job. Oklahoma passed such legislation. You cannot be forced to join a union in order to have a job. Now, in some states like California, which is highly unionized, and I think this is still the case, if you are going into an employment situation that has a union shop, you have to at least, you don't have to join the union, but you at least have to pay the portion of the union dues that go to collective bargaining, which is almost all of the union dues. They're going to say go to collective bargaining, which means that by and large, on the whole, what it ends up doing is it means that you're going to join the union. Now, a lot of employees don't like this. Why? Well, because it can be expensive. Union dues can be expensive. But the union provides a big benefit in terms of collective bargaining on your behalf, right? So these laws in places like Oklahoma were passed that said basically if you have a union shop, you can't be forced. There's no closed shop rules. You can't be forced to join that union. Now, what the unions argue is that this allows people to become free riders, in that the union is going to negotiate on your behalf whether or not you pay the dues if you can't be forced to pay the dues. And so you have an incentive to not pay the dues, right? Now, you can overcome through economics the free rider problem in a number of ways. So lots of organizations that advocate on behalf of various interest groups do so, and there are lots of people that free ride on those organizations. A big example of that
would be something that I've started getting mail for, much to my horror and dismay, something called AARP. Anybody know what AARP is? I'm 52. They started sending me this mail at 50. It's the American Association of Retired People. Now, what does the AARP advocate for? Well, one of the things that they advocate for, under the George W. Bush administration, he said that he wanted to privatize Social Security. AARP went crazy over this. They had a very effective ad against this that absolutely targeted. And so the ad was, this couple are in a house and they've got somebody that comes in and says, well, your fireplace is full of bats and sticks and stuff like that, so we're just gonna have to tear the whole thing down. And they're like, wait, no, what do you mean? And they're like, nope, gotta wreck it all. And they took a wrecking ball to the entire house. And the analogy was that was what the Bush administration was gonna do to Social Security, was by privatizing it, basically saying that you could take your money out of Social Security, or a portion of your money out of Social Security, and invest it, that was going to destroy Social Security. Now, a lot of Americans might choose to do that because they look at Social Security and they think that it's fiscally or financially unsound. Social Security will run out of money. Now, there's reasons for that, not the least of which is that some administrations have raided that fund, right? But there are ways to fix it, but they're not politically popular. How do you fix Social Security? Well, one of the things you could do is you could means test it. That's really unpopular. Because what you're going to say is that people who make certain amounts of money don't get Social Security, or they get a reduced benefit for Social Security. For a lot of you, Social Security will be the only retirement that you have. One of the reasons that I chose this profession is because I get teacher's retirement, which is a defined benefit plan, which means that when I retire, I know what I'll get every month for the rest of my life. What you will get when you retire is completely dependent upon what? Two things. What is it completely dependent upon? Your ability to save is one. That's a big one. Yeah, your ability to save, which is hard for young people when they're starting out. So what most companies do in the past, what people did is they had things like big companies and even some smaller companies had things called pension plans that were defined benefit plans. So if you went to work for GM or Ford or American Airlines, you got a pension, which meant that when you retired, you knew how much you were going to get every month. And then companies realized that they had this huge liability out there and they stopped offering pensions. So what did they do? They started offering defined contribution plans. Instead of defined benefit plans, you get a defined contribution plan, which means what? That's what you call a 401k or a 403b, or there's some other lesser known plans under the code that allow you, for example, there's now a plan, it's not a 401k. 401k's the advantage is that you get to put the money in pre-tax, which means that it lowers your tax liability. So it's an incentive for you to invest, to save money in this plan. There are now ones where you pay the tax up front, but it's tax-free when you start to draw it out. And there's a debate, like, which should you choose? Well, if you have the money, probably the better deal is to go ahead and eat the taxes now and get the money tax-free if you can put that amount of money. But most people can't afford it. The thing that's nice about the tax, lowering your tax burden, is that it reduces the impact of that contribution on your take-home pay.
But it's gonna be dependent upon your ability to save now. How many of you have a 401k or some kind of individual retirement plan? 2, 3. Your ability to save and the value of the property that you invest in, the stocks or bonds that you invest in. So,
Why is this doing this? Oh, I launched the slide, that's right.
so we have these defined benefit plans versus defined contribution plans. And all of these things are negotiated, and they're oftentimes negotiated by unions who say, if I'm negotiating on your behalf, you should at least pay the part of the stuff that comes out to negotiate. And a lot of people say, well, I don't want you to negotiate on my behalf, right? I'll do it on my own. A more interesting aspect, or that we can think about in terms of the right to work, is the right to a job. So Catholic social philosophy, the UN Declaration of Human Rights and stuff like that, basically say that we should try to encourage people who want to work to be able to do so. Now, who's going to provide those jobs? Well, during the Great Depression, who provided those jobs for people who wanted to work? Who provided the jobs during the Great Depression if you wanted to work and you were out of work? The government, through the Works Project Administration. And we have lots of things that are built all across this country. If you went into Guthrie until very recently, we had a bridge called Viaduct that was built under the Works Project Administration. Another sense of right to work that we can talk about that has moral import is the right to continued employment. Once you have the job, what are your expectations? And in some places like California and in Puerto Rico, for example, which is part of the United States, there are much more restrictive laws on firing. Once you pass a certain probationary period in Puerto Rico and in some states like California, it becomes much more difficult to fire workers for just any cause out there, right? And those, of course, employers will say that that impedes on their moral rights. And they like something called the doctrine of employment at will. The doctrine of employment at will basically says you're free to leave at any moment that you want, and we are free to terminate that employment at any time that you want. Now, there are certain restrictions on employment at will. You cannot fire people. You can fire people for any reason but the wrong reason, right? So you can say, I don't like you, you're not performing well, or we're getting rid of, a certain percentage of our workforce. We're not telling you why through a reduction in force, and we don't have to give you any reason or no reason at all. The restrictions on that are you can't infringe upon basic civil rights, even in private employment. So you can't fire people for race, creed, color, national origin, religion, things like that, except in limited circumstances. What are those limited circumstances, and should we have those? So, for example, churches can discriminate in their hiring, right? And that sort of makes sense to us. No one would seriously say you have to hire a minister at the Methodist Church who's a Baptist, right? And there's a reason we have different denominations. There are different interpretations of that. But at UCO, can we say no Methodists? No. We can't do that, or we can't fire the Methodists. You can't fire people if they are participating in union activities or if it violates public policy. Things like whistleblower protections. If you work for a company that is Sarbanes-Oxley reporting, you can't fire people because they engage in whistleblowing activities. Due process in the workplace. Okay. With regard to marketing and this idea of living the brand, one of the things that marketing scholars have started to focus on, like myself, is this idea of should we offer due process in the workplace? And if we do, what should that look like? And managers generally don't like this idea of due process or
participatory rights in the workplace, which is the other thing that's the sort of second side of the coin of this, is should we have workplace democracy, which I think is the next slide. Yeah, participatory rights, workplace democracy. So we'll talk about these together. The thing is that if people don't feel like they're treated fairly, they may not invest and they may not engage in what we call living the brand, which is this belief that they're going to give it their all for companies. And one of the biggest companies that historically has engaged in living the brand is Southwest Airlines. Southwest didn't pay the most. Southwest, didn't have necessarily all the best benefits, but really employees of Southwest lived the brand. Why? One of the reasons was that they had good workplace due process and good workplace participatory rights. Now, what does due process involve? Well, we can talk about two types of due process. And the biggest one that we focus on in the employment setting is what we call PDP, or procedural due process. So what is procedural due process? The idea of procedural due process is that if we set in place certain procedures, that will ensure fundamental fairness. And again, if we go back to our early discussions in this class of what is fair, well, that can be an amorphous concept. But the idea is that if we put in place these kinds of procedures, that what you'll end up with is you'll end up with fair results. Now, what are those procedures? Well, if we analogize it to the criminal law, what is it that you want? What is it that we think makes our system of government more fair than other systems of government? Historically, in the past, most systems of government operated on the theory of you're guilty until you prove yourself innocent. If you're accused of a crime, it's up to you to prove yourself innocent in lots of past societies. And there are lots of, now almost nobody says that they do this, but lots of dictatorial regimes engage in guilty until proven innocent, which means what? Why is that fundamentally unfair? What's our system of government focus on? What is the heart of criminal justice in this country?
Innocent.
That you are innocent until you are proven guilty. And that guilt must be proven what? Beyond a reasonable doubt. Not beyond a shadow of a doubt, but beyond a reasonable doubt. What does that mean in a criminal justice system if we're analogizing to criminal justice? Well, what it means is that we have these substantive protections in the Constitution under the Bill of Rights. What are these substantive protections? Well, the biggest one that's part of substantive due process is the idea that, and you should know this from watching, how many of you watch police shows? They're one of the most popular genres on television are police shows. I absolutely hate them. I hate all Law and Order shows. My mother just loved these shows. She loved Law and Order. But you should know these. They should come tripping off your tongue because you've watched all these police shows growing up all over. And like every kid, I wanted to be, my father was an FBI agent, and I wanted to be an FBI agent in the worst way. And I didn't become an FBI agent. I went to law school. That's historically how you became an FBI agent, was you went to law school and then you went into the bureau, and I thought about that. But then I found this other path. So anyway, as a result of a case called Miranda versus Arizona, you know that you have a Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. And the police are going to have to tell you that you have this right
when they arrest you. Now, arrest is not actually a very useful term from a criminal procedure legal standpoint. There's lots of things, there's lots of steps before like you're in the handcuffs. And where they have to Mirandize you becomes a question of whether or not you are seized. So for Fourth Amendment purposes, we don't talk about arrest, we talk about seizure. So when the man with the badge stops you, your question should be, what?
Being stopped.
Huh?
What am I being stopped for?
No. That should not be your question. Your question should be, am I free to go? At the point at which he says no, you are seized for Fourth Amendment purposes. Now, whether or not they have to Mirandize you under the Fifth Amendment becomes a question based on the totality of the circumstances. But definitely at the point in time at which you are in the handcuffs, right? They need to Mirandize you. Now they're gonna try and not Mirandize you. And what does the Miranda warning say? You have the right to remain silent. If you give up the right to remain silent, anything you say, and officers carry this little card around with them, can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. Where's the right to an attorney listed in the Constitution? The Sixth Amendment to the Constitution, but you have a Fifth Amendment right to an attorney at the point that they're Mirandizing you, even though the Fifth Amendment doesn't say that you have a right to an attorney. But the court says that you have a Fifth Amendment right to an attorney because the attorney is going to tell you what? When the man with the badge is talking to you, which is why your question should be, am I free to go? The attorney's going to tell you that you need to what? Shut up. You have the right to remain silent. If you give up the right to remain silent, anything you say will and can be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney and have an attorney question at your questioning. At your questioning, if you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you by the court. That's a Fifth Amendment right to counsel, not a Sixth Amendment right to counsel. It's important to know what the right is and when it attaches. And we think that this is called procedural due process with a substantive due process. So you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to not talk. That's a substantive right. We're going to tell you about this right procedurally, and we think that that creates a fairer system, doesn't it? Why do we have this? Well, the idea is that if you get the procedure correct, you might end up with better results. We don't disappear people in this country like they do in dictatorships, where they say you're accused of this crime, and if you can't prove yourself innocent, you go off to the gulag. Right? That's procedurally what we do. Now, in the workplace, we can't give you all of that, right? So what is the heart of procedural due process and substantive due process? Well, the substantive due process often comes in the form of the participation rights that we'll talk about in a minute, but the procedural due process is generally two things: notice and hearing. Now, in the criminal system, what you're gonna get is you're gonna get a full range of procedural due process. And where do you get the most procedural due process? You get the most procedural due process if you can be denied life or liberty. Right? If you're gonna go to jail, or we're going to take your life, you're gonna get the most amount. And generally speaking, you get the most amount if the death penalty is sought. Right? There's additional generally safeguards if we go after the death penalty. Now, obviously, employers can't impose the death penalty, but they can impose lots of things on you. How much of this notice and hearing should they get? Well, in a court system, in a criminal justice system, you're going to get, you're gonna have the right to be either indicted by a grand jury. There's nothing grand about a grand jury. A grand jury would indict a ham sandwich. Or you're going to have the right to a preliminary hearing in state court. Now, at the federal level, you have to be indicted by a grand jury. Everyone has to be indicted by a grand jury. That's just the rules. Nothing grand about a grand jury other than the size, but you have to be indicted by a grand jury. So that indictment is going to contain what the specifics, the notice of the charges are against you. You have violated title blah, 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 blah of the United States Code in doing the following acts, right? Well, in an employment setting, we're not gonna do that, but you should be told like what we're firing you for or why we're disciplining you. Most companies now have what's called a progressive discipline policy. Why do they do that? Well, the idea is that, you know, maybe employees just need to be trained. They didn't understand. You know, there was some failure. Maybe they're having a bad day. And so you don't just instantly go to fire. You go through like, well, you know, you showed up late today. Why did you show up late? Well, my kid was sick. Well, that's understandable, right? Maybe there's an excuse. But if you're showing up late every day, well, don't show up late anymore, or we're going to, you know, engage in a written reprimand. Today, we're doing oral counseling. We're going to do a written reprimand. So notice and then hearing. Now, how much hearing you get? Again, in a court system, what do you have a right to? If you're accused of this horrendous crime, so at common law, murder was defined as the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought. That's what we call in law an elements test. Unlawful means that you have to meet every element of the test in order to be found guilty, right? Unlawful killing of a human being, malice aforethought. This is what we call the mens rea. Which is the guilty mind aspect. So this was the common law definition of murder. Unlawful killing. So you have to meet every element. It has to be an unlawful killing. What's a lawful killing?
Protecting yourself.
Self-defense is a lawful killing. That's a lawful killing. A police officer killing in the line of duty, that's a lawful killing. Soldier in war is a lawful killing. Defense of others can be a lawful killing, depending on where you are. Right? So that's a lawful killing. If you are facing a burglar in your house and they have a gun and you shoot them, that's a lawful killing. So you have to meet every element of the test, and you're going to have a jury that's going to have to weigh the evidence, right? And that's going to be a unanimous verdict of a member of a certain number, usually 12 people in a jury, and you have to have a unanimous verdict in order to get a conviction. Now, obviously, we're not going to do that in an employment setting, right? So what is the notice and hearing? You have the right generally to be told by HR, these are the things your supervisor says, and you can present evidence against you. Now, in a court of law, you're going to have the right to present evidence, to call witnesses, to testify. You never do that. Criminal defendants never do that, right? Why? Because your testimony or if you testify, it can be held against you, but your silence cannot. Now try to get a jury to understand that. Juries always want people to say, I didn't do it, right? But you're going to get an instruction from the judge that says you cannot hold the defendant's silence against them. So notice and hearing is going to be the heart of procedural due process. Again, what companies often argue is that this infringes upon free market, property rights, and efficiency considerations. And so what I would argue as a marketer is, yes, it does limit your efficiency and maybe your property rights. But if people feel like they are being treated fairly, they are generally willing to give you more than if they're not. And it's a balancing test. The other part of that is participation rights, workplace democracy. What kinds of things should you have? Well, one of the things that workplace democracy can create is it can create opportunities for you to learn about things that maybe go beyond what the employee's roles are. It creates conditions of self-respect. It decreases alienation and burnout. So let's take an example of this. One of the things that 3M does is they give people, their scientists in their research department, time to work on projects that they want that are of interest to them. Now, if something useful comes from that, who owns it? 3M. How many of you heard of a movie called Romy and Michelle's High School Reunion? Nobody's heard of this movie? It's a rather old movie. It stars Mira Sorvino, I think, and I think it's Mira Sorvino.
Christina Applegate, is that her?
No, it's let me look. They decide they're not doing real well in life, and so Mira Sorvino and Lisa Kudrow, who's on Friends, and they're not doing very well, so they decide that they're going to go to their high school reunion and they're going to tell people that they invented something so that they sound successful, that nobody knows what it is, like who invented it. And they decide that they're going to tell everybody that they invented Post-its. And it turns out somebody there knows that, like, the story of who invented Post-its. This was, 3M works on adhesives. They gave their scientists an opportunity to work on things. And one of their researchers came up with a product that was not necessarily very adhesive. But it was adhesive enough that you could attach it to something else and not do damage to the something that you're attaching it to. Lots of adhesive. So if you use tape, before they had Post-its, a lot of us would take pieces of paper and tape, and we would tape it to things like the wall, the refrigerator. And the problem with that is that tape, which is really more adhesive than Post-its, will pull the paint off the wall. Now they've come up with, as a result of things like Post-its and that kind of adhesive, something called painter's tape. How many of you have used painter's tape? And what painter's tape does is when you peel it off of the wall, it peels off clean without taking off the paint. But you have to do it within a certain period of time, otherwise it becomes equally as sticky as regular tape. But anyways, as a result of the fact that you have an environment in which people are allowed to express themselves and participate, they have decreased alienation and burnout. And people have come up with this thing, which, you know, Post-its may be one of the biggest things that 3M has come out with that's been wildly successful. We all use them. Even in an age in which we're doing away with lots of paper products, we're still using them. It fosters greater social participation. The arguments against it are basically property rights, managerial expertise, and efficiency. A big portion of our ability to satisfy customers comes from our employees and ideas that they have. And so management can become myopic. And I would argue that with regard to this idea of managerial expertise, one of the things that happens is managers can oftentimes become myopic. And that particularly happens when people move further and further up the chain and further away from the customers that they're serving. Employee health and safety, these have largely been moral rights that we've now incorporated into the law. So the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970 has really impacted. That was one of the things that, as a result of great moral failures during the Industrial Revolution, has worked its way into the legal acumen of the United States. Now, the issue is how much safety and health do we have to provide? And issues of autonomy, right? Can we make every workplace absolutely 100%, safe? No. If you're working on a construction site, we can have lots of safety, make sure that you have hard hats, the correct protective gear, personal protective gear, and things like that. But it's still an inherently dangerous and risky environment. But as a result of gross moral failure in the private sector, we've gotten these acts, and they've worked their way as a result of moral failings into the into the legal protection. So it's a law that is both moral and legal, or has moral implications and legal implications. Privacy in the workplace. This is one of the things, when I first started teaching ethics and marketing, privacy was a big issue. And my students actually cared a lot about privacy. And what I've noticed is that over the course of 20 years of teaching about this stuff in marketing, 10 years I spent teaching political science, particularly among business students, the number of people that are concerned about privacy has greatly decreased because your generation in particular has never really experienced privacy. When I first started teaching this course, I would tell people the average American at that point in time was photographed on average something like 35 to 55 times a day. That was every time you walked past an ATM machine, or if you went into a bank, something like, probably a lot of you have never even actually been on the inside of a bank. How many of you actually, you can set up your banking completely online now. So there's no need to, how many of you have actually walked into a bank? Okay, almost everybody's at least walked into a bank and set up a bank account. Don't even have to do that anymore. Don't have to, when I started working, we would go over every payday. We were paid once a month. We're still paid once a month. We would go over to the bursar's counter in the Nye University Center, and we would all line up and we would get our paychecks, live checks. And you would actually have to sign the back of that. They didn't call them checks because we're the state of Oklahoma, so they called them pay warrants, which is sort of a horrible term. I don't know why they were a check. But they were a warrant because they were not drawn on a bank, they were drawn on the state treasury. And so, it would say to the treasurer pay, to the order of whatever. So we would actually then take it to our bank and you would endorse it with your bank account and deposit it in your bank and go about your merry way. So the only places that had security cameras, because they were expensive to install and they were cumbersome, were banks, and usually those were overwritten every so many, hours, days, or minutes. And they were only kept if there was a bank robbery. So there were ATM machines that usually had a camera on them, banks, and then as that technology became cheaper, convenience stores added that to their protection, right? The security surveillance. Now, how many times a day are you photographed? It's literally probably hundreds, if not thousands. Every time you walk into a Walmart, you are photographed. And not just once, multiple times. If you use the self-checkout, those are, how many of you have noticed the camera right above? And it knows whether or not you skipped putting something in the bag. And if you do, there's a person that's standing there at the self-checkout that looks like they're looking at their cell phone. It's not, it's the computer and AI telling them that you skipped something putting in your bag. And they'll come over and they'll say things like, we just need to help you. Oh, this terminal is acting up. Let me take you over here and check you out, right? And they'll suspend the transaction. Where I was in Dillon, Colorado over spring break, and they came over and it was like, literally, this is a new one on me. I'd never seen this one before. It was replaying the footage. So I had a bunch of fresh produce and I scanned the one and it says quantity needed. And I entered in the quantity that I had. And then I didn't scan the others because it asked me for the quantity rather than scanning the barcode on every bell pepper. It said quantity and I had 3 and I just put them in the bag. And so literally it pops up this video and the guy comes over and is having to watch the video and then count the number of items that I have in my bag. So you're photographed thousands of times. Do you really have any privacy left in the workplace? It's really debatable. Do you have any privacy left anywhere? Really debatable. Because you're doing everything on your phone, all of that can be tracked. Everything that you do is tracked. You want to avoid people. When I was a kid, there were these people that would talk about, like, they were members of something called the John Birch Society, which you all have never heard of. They would talk about like getting off the grid. Only paying cash so that you couldn't be tracked. That's virtually impossible. You're gonna have to go to having a car, like, my car has OnStar on it. What does that mean? You're being tracked. You're gonna have to get rid of this device because it's constantly tracking you. Right? Can you get away with paying cash? There's lots of places that don't take cash anymore. You have to pay with electronic funds. So that has become one of those things. It's interesting to me to watch how this idea of privacy has really evolved, and the concern, and most of my students don't seem to have much concern for it. I'm out of time, so we'll get to employee responsibilities next Tuesday. I will send out an email on where you can go to earn bonus points if you want to participate in the CSI thing on Thursday for our big sales competition.